There is a seemingly universal concept that I've been mulling over, force concentration theory, which I wanted to share. Force concentration theory is the idea that the more concentrated a force is, the greater the effect over having the same amount of total force spread out over a larger area. This applies to martial arts concepts, personal efforts, as well as business, unionization, and government. The easiest way to understand this is how it applies to martial arts. On screen, you'll see a diagram of a fist. Some martial arts teach you to punch with your 2 knuckles, some with your 3, and on very rare occasions, you might have a coach tell you to hit with your full fist. But most of the time, it's the knuckles. Both using the set of 2 or the set of 3 can make sense, but the knuckles are essential for a variety of reasons, and force concentration is one of them. Let's say I'm going to hit you in the face with a baseball bat. No matter what, I am going to swing it at the same speed and with the same amount of force behind it. Assuming that you will be hit no matter what, would you rather be hit by a bare baseball bat or one with a nail sticking out? Assuming it's lined up to where the force of the swing goes into the nail and then into your face. Hopefully, everyone listening with at least room temperature IQ said the bare baseball bat. The force being spread out will probably still cause a concussion, maybe even broken bones, which is much better still than being stabbed in the brain by a nail. There is a greater effect achieved when you have the same amount of force funneled into and focused on a smaller area. This also likely applies to most facets of our personal lives. Like the self-help meme on screen, you can do most anything, at least to an extent, but you cannot possibly do everything. Instead, to achieve your best results, you'll need to concentrate your efforts on one or a few items that are most valuable to you. If you try to do everything, you will likely do it poorly. Of course, putting all your eggs in one basket also has a lot of risk to it. This also applies to the centralization of power in society. Any one business or businesses acquiring either a monopoly or oligopoly, or even just having an anti-competitive level of market share, can be detrimental to an industry. The lone surviving providers of a good or service do gain economies of scale in the short term, generally allowing them to provide more at a lower cost. But this is short-lived, as eventually companies succumb to greed and try to increase profits by jacking up profit margins without an increase in quality or quantity provided, or by making the product or service actively worse in an effort to cut costs. Worse yet, some modern businesses are deliberately trying to become monopolies just to jack up their prices. They don't even have a functional business model that profits without achieving a monopoly. Uber is one example here. Now, this also applies to unions. The First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution includes a clause saying that Congress shall make no law forbidding the people from peaceful assembly. So, if we want to all organize to negotiate better pay, time off, or benefits, we are absolutely free to do so. At least we're supposed to be. This is important because if we assume that all employers across the U.S. have equal total negotiating power as all employees across the U.S., then we would expect that in the absence of unions, the same amount of power is concentrated in a smaller number of decision-making entities than the number of employees. If you have 50 businesses with 10,000 employees, that's 50 decision-making entities versus 10,000 decision-making entities. That means that an equal amount of force applied by the businesses in negotiations would be more effective than that same amount of force applied by the employees. However, if the employees are allowed to and do unionize, you could end up with, for example, a few dozen unions and about 2/3 of the employees in them. This does not necessarily mean that you achieve a perfect balance of power, even if you would want to, which maybe you shouldn't want to, but this does mean that, generally speaking, power is more evenly concentrated between two vaguely competing groups of society. Just like monopoly or oligopoly, problems happen when unions gain too much concentrated power. In August of 2023, UPS drivers organized to negotiate for significant pay raises. That jettisoned the average driver's annual income to $170K, which is awesome. While this wasn't enough to make UPS no longer profitable, this did drive the company's leadership to pursue cost-cutting measures, and 20,000 jobs were lost. Now, I think you might be able to argue that if the total income gained by all the drivers' pay increases exceeds the income lost to those 20,000 unemployed people, that some net benefit was reaped by the organization of labor. But this is definitely not a scenario where everyone wins. Some people, 20,000 of them, definitely lost. In a more extreme example, a dumb or overzealous set of unionizers could all refuse to work unless they get compensated enough that the business is no longer profitable, in which case the business has no reason to continue to function. And if it's in the red instead of achieving a net zero between sales and costs, it may have leadership scrambling to find a way to be profitable right up until that business goes bankrupt and then shuts down. And at that point, none of the employees get their pay and benefits anymore because the business ceases to exist, which also means the business owners, executives, and investors aren't making money either. Everyone loses. Just as there can be win-win scenarios, there can also be lose-lose scenarios. One potential solution to this, to some degree, is a certain amount of government regulation of both unionization and businesses to ensure neither obtains absolute overmatch in their total power or effective concentrated power. But we have to be careful when we ask the government to do something. With very incremental increases to how much the government is involved in the life of its populace on an average day, that's a little bit more potency, more power available to every drop of corruption that exists somewhere in the system. Unfortunately, that also gives more potential avenues for government power to be exploited for personal gain, which then gives more incentive for bad actors to succumb to temptation and engage in some sort of corruption. So any amount of pre-existing corruption becomes more potent, but then also there's a greater incentive to increase the amount of corruption in the system. In other words, concentrating more power into the government can also cause problems. At a minimum, all the different things you need to register or get a license for are annoying. At worst, who gets elected is now a big deal for you. But if the government weren't very involved in our lives, then if your less preferred candidate won or lost, it just wouldn't be a big deal. All that to say, in general, society should strive to have dispersed power or diffuse power across society. The government should be pretty small with limited involvement in the lives of the average American. Still, some antitrust laws should exist and be enforced to ensure no company or cohort of companies gain an anti-competitive degree of market share. People should be free to assemble into unions to enhance their negotiating power with companies, but those same people should be careful not to destroy their own livelihoods. You only have one life to live. Grow it relentlessly.